I thank you, Donna. This is Louise Kenny on the special events team. Thank you very much for joining us. We have, I think, a particularly interesting topic today, one of relevance to us here in the Alexandria area, now Arlington and Northern Virginia, about George Washington's Mount Vernon and the work being done there uh, to renovate it and bring it up for the next 200 to 300 years, and it's so that it stands in good stead there. We have Tom Reinhart, who is the Director of Preservation at Mount Vernon. And Tom has a very interesting background. We were just chatting, and he said, I said, gee, you really seem to know what you wanted to do right from the beginning going to college, because his career really has led him to where he is now. And he's had some very interesting occupations and education. He graduated from College of William and Mary in Virginia with a degree in the classics, and then went on to get an MA in classical architecture at Florida State University. He has conducted archaeological field work in Athens and Greece, and also in Israel. He also has a MA in architectural history and preservation at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Between 1999 and 2013, he worked in Maryland as a state historic in the State Historic Preservation Office, and he really led the efforts of that organization, the Maryland Historical Trust, to chronicle and also preserve archaeology throughout the state. So he conducted research and field work and oversaw the restoration of hundreds of resources throughout Maryland. He's also taught in various universities, including the University of Maryland in College Park, GW University here in Washington, and North Carolina University in Chapel Hill. He has been with Mount Vernon for 13 years. So without further ado, I mean, he really knows Mount Vernon. I'm really thrilled that we became aware of Tom and his expertise, and especially at this critical time when we're all watching the renovation at Mount Vernon happen. We will see it up close and personal today. So Tom, it's all yours.
Thank you, Louise. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for inviting me to speak to you today. As Louise said, I've been the Director of Preservation at George Washington's Mount Vernon since 2012. And over the past almost 13 years, Mount Vernon's Department of Historic Preservation and Collections have undertaken a series of restorations, which, as of today, have addressed the exterior of the mansion, and all but two of the principal rooms in the house. During this work, I've been extremely fortunate to see almost every part of George Washington's home, the parts that you see when you visit, but also inside of walls, attics, cellars, places that people generally don't get to see. Since January of last year, we've been at work on the largest and most impactful preservation work in the history of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. What we've learned about the mansion during this project, called Mansion Revitalization, added to the knowledge gained from the restoration work of the last decade. And it means that now we know more about the history, evolution, alteration, and use of the mansion than at any other point in history, including when its most famous resident lived there. Today, I will speak about the groundbreaking mansion revitalization work. Then we'll share some discoveries we've made in the last decade. And I will focus particularly on something you don't hear a lot about if you come and visit Mount Vernon, which is the mansion before George Washington made it his primary home in 1755. So I'm going to load up my presentation here. Is everyone seeing that first slide? I hope so.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. All right. As I mentioned, since January of last year, we have been at work on revitalizing the mansion in one of the most extensive preservation projects in the history of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, the partial reframing of the first floor and the restoration of the mansion's cellar. The genesis of this project was a chance discovery in January of 2017 that revealed a previously unnoticed condition in the building. The work of numerous different campaigns over the past 2 centuries to rid the house of rot and termites in its first floor and lower wall frames had left the walls severed from the first floor. Our efforts to address this condition has led us into areas of the house that have not been accessed in a very long time, in some cases not since the 18th century. So, in the first slide, you see just a photograph of what's called a box frame. So this is actually what you see on the left there is the blacksmith shop at Mount Vernon. And that yellow arrow points to the principal horizontal member at the bottom of the wall, which is known as the wall sill. And that sits directly upon the foundation. It's what ties all of the framing members, the posts, the studs of the wall into all of the framing members, the summer beams, the floor joists. It ties them together, and it really makes the bottom of the box frame. And note in that red circle in the corner, there is a diagonal down brace, it's called, which locks the corners and the walls into square. And these connections between the walls and the floor, especially in the corners, are critical for keeping the structure of a framed house like this tight, plumb, and level. If we look on the right-hand side of the screen, now we're looking into the wall of the front parlor of the mansion, and you see a stud and a diagonal brace pointed out. But note that running underneath them, there is no sill. Instead, there are small piles of brick and slate that are holding up each individual wall frame. So in place of the timber sill that used to occupy that space throughout the mansion's frame, these masonry and stone piles were added. A structural analysis by an engineer told us in January 2017 that the house was safe to occupy, but at risk in a world of weather events that were more frequent and destructive. Between 2017 and 2024, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association planned this project, the largest, as I said, in its history. In addition to the structural assessment that we had done, we did what's called a historic structures report, focusing on the cellar, the frame, and the foundation of the house. That's an in-depth study of both documentation and the physical fabric of the house. And a rehabilitation plan was developed. The project is a $40 million 2-year effort to address preservation, environmental, and stewardship needs in Washington's home, with the ultimate goal of presenting to the nation for its 250th birthday in 2026, a mansion prepared to face another quarter millennium as a place of pilgrimage for millions of visitors annually. So, why we need to act. The mansion is nearly 300 years old, and it's held up admirably. But remember that when it was constructed in 1734, it was for George Washington's father, Augustine Washington. It was built to be a home, not a museum. And it was really framed structurally to hold about a dozen people, not the millions of people who visit, the million plus people that visit every year, and have visited steadily since the end of the 18th century. Since being opened up as a shrine in 1860, the mansion has been asked to accommodate more people than its builders ever would have imagined. In 2019, the mansion welcomed 1.1 million visitors, and Bohr stresses its structure was never engineered to bear, and it has done so for 160 years. Preservation work on the house started even before the mansion became a museum. And here's some of those 1.1 million visitors outside. The repairs began even before it was a museum in 1797. Since that time, when Washington fretted in a letter that his guests he feared that they would fall into the cellar due to the rot in one of the major structural beams at the north end of the house. So here in this photograph, you can see that there are active termites in this photograph from the 1930s. You can see how damaged and rotted the major timbers were nearly 100 years ago. The most extensive repair campaigns were carried out in the 1930s. And that, as I said, makes them nearly 100 years old. And as you might imagine, repairs can outlive their useful life. And these repairs that were made during the 1930s are quickly approaching the point where they will outlive their useful life. Another reason we need to act is that infrastructure that had been added into the house, electrical systems, HVAC, which was heating, air conditioning, and ventilation that had been added in the 1990s. The electricity was added in 1909 by Thomas Edison himself. These systems, in some cases, the electrical systems have been replaced multiple times, not always taking out and removing the earlier system. So we have multiple generations of infrastructure that are piled up. And the more that has been added over the centuries, the more difficult it gets to do the repair work, to do the preservation work, to do the monitoring that is needed in order to make sure that as possible. Second are environmental goals to manage moisture. We will do this by adding in a new drainage system around the house and inside the cellar, and also to create new mechanical systems appropriately designed for the mansion, the collections it holds, and for our visitors, but prioritizing the mansion and the collections and not the visitors, because the house wants to be warmer than we do in the summer and cooler than we do in the winter. And we are going to make sure that the house is as comfortable as possible. And third, we have stewardship goals. We want to remove later intrusive elements to improve our ability to do preservation work, to improve our ability to interpret the cellar, which is a critical part of the mansion's history. And we also want to upgrade our documentation on the digital level, expanding a 3D modeling program, a historic building information model that we have of the house, which is the way by which we manage the information that we have about the house. So work on the framing will strengthen surviving original framing and replace missing timbers to make the whole of the original 18th century, to make whole the original 18th century frame of the house. So Mount Vernon's retention of original fabric, that means the 18th century material in the house, is extraordinary, with survival of permanent elements. And by permanent elements, I mean things like framing members, windows, doors, trim around windows and doors, things like that, is as opposed to sacrificial elements like roof shingles, which are always intended to be replaced cyclically on a building. So for permanent elements, our preservation hovers in the high 80s to low 90s, depending on what type of elements we are talking about. But from the first floor frame down, so underneath the first floorboards, our survival is at about 48% due to moisture conditions, rot, and termites over the 2.5 centuries that the house has existed. And here you see on the screen a framing plan of what the frame would have looked like in the 18th century. And the white framing elements are original surviving pieces from the 18th century, and the tan elements are ones that we need to create new and reinstall into the cellar. So you can see the survival rate is not as great as in the rest of the house. In the cellar, if you've ever done the National Treasure Tour on a visit to Mount Vernon, in the cellar, you would have seen sandstone walls that were erected in the 1770s to subdivide the cellar into storage rooms. But that sandstone, which is the local building stone from Stafford County, Virginia, that sandstone it has really deteriorated over the course of the centuries because of the fluctuations in relative humidity causes a wicking of moisture up from the ground and then evaporation out of the face of the wall, and that causes the sandstone to deteriorate. And you can see here that the mortar joints that hold these sandstone blocks together have fared better than the sandstone itself. So we're going to address the conditions that causes this deterioration. We're going to be doing conservation on the stone blocks. We're going to be doing some veneering with new sandstone, and in drastic cases, replacing some of the stones outright. And then for environmental improvements, we will be replacing our HVAC system, which is about 25 years old and is really at the end of its useful life. We're intending to improve control of individual rooms by adding zones. That means that rooms that are on the south end of the house that get sun all day and are warmer can have a different temperature and relative humidity than, say, the big entertaining space, the new room on the north end of the house that doesn't get very much light and therefore stays cooler and damper. We can actually balance each room to its own perfect environmental conditions. We will improve the capacity for humidification and dehumidification. And in particular, we're looking to do that in the cellar. And then we're going to be rerouting some of the ductwork of the existing system and the new system underground and through chimney flues in order to get them out of sight in the cellar so that we can improve our interpretation of the cellar as sort of the storage and service hub, sort of the upstairs, downstairs model. This is going to be the downstairs where we talk about service to the Washingtons and their guests upstairs. And then, as I mentioned, we will be improving drainage as well. So one more time to look at this. Again, we have our box frame. We're focusing on replacing the sills. We are restabilizing the house by improving the connection between the frame of the house and the foundations of the house. So how do we go about sticking in a new wooden sill at the bottom of a wall of a standing house, you might ask? Well, the answer is very, very carefully. In order to do this, we had to come up with an extremely complicated system of cantilevered steel beams which hold the house up. And so you can see here on the left-hand side of that white part of the screen, we've got the bottom of the mansion's wall, and at the lower part we have the foundation, and we're going to be trying to replace the sill beneath, just above the foundation. So we've bolted on we expose the bottom of the wall frame. We bolt on a big steel channel into the framing members, and then we will lever in steel beams, the beams that are actually called steel beam in this little drawing, and then they have a fulcrum point at their middle, and we weight the back end of them so that they balance on that fulcrum point, and the weight is calculated to balance to the exact weight of the mansion. So looks a little scary. I'm not going to lie, it was a little scary when we engaged the framing, but it all went smoothly without any problems. So we've already done here. You can see the north end of the house, just showing the location of that shoring. That was done last year, has been removed already, and the new room has been repaired and is open again to the public. Here you can see some of that steel shoring along the north end of the house, which for all intents and purposes now is no longer, for the time being, no longer a grove of locust trees, but is a massive construction site, as you can see. Once we shored the house in place, we didn't jack it up. We just shored it in place. We just took the weight off of the foundations, so much so that all you could do with the foundations, we only lifted it enough so that you could stick a sheet of paper between the bottom of the framing members and the top of the foundation. Then we removed the added stacks of brick and slate, which had been put in the 1930s, and the mansion was then basically hovering above the foundation by about a foot. Now, once we got the house floating in space, we began to remove floorboards. Here, this is the new room, that big north entertaining room. We pull up the original 18th century floorboards, which survived, although the framing on which they sat did not survive. It was replaced in a rather ad hoc, pell-mell way. We got the floorboards up, removed all brand new white oak joists, which were cut from white oak trees that we harvested from the estate. They were worked green. They are, in effect, the great-great-grandchildren of the oak trees that Augustine Washington's carpenters fabricated the mansion out of in 1734, and that Washington's carpenters used to create the additions to the house. This new room addition was framed in 1776. So on the left there, you see the new framing in place, and on the right, you see the tenons, the ends that will be fitted into the new sills that sit right on top of that foundation. The brickwork that you see there is the top of the cellar foundation. In order to make the connection then, so that sort of ties the floors back in to the sills, but in order to connect the walls back into the sills, and here you see a brand new sill, which is lying on top of the foundation, and you can see here the bottom of the framing members. The darker wood is the 18th century wood, and the fresher wood is the new wood that our preservation carpenters have cut out of our Mount Vernon estate oak. We've tied them together and then tied them into the bottom, onto the top of the sill, thereby completing the box frame once again and stabilizing the house. And then finally, let me see if I can get this to advance. Oops. Finally, our carpenters very carefully reinstalled the 18th century floorboards of the new room, and then we reinstalled it to some extent. Some of the artwork has been kept out because we didn't, with fluctuations in the interior environmental conditions, we just didn't want to, some things we didn't want to put back in. But the new room again has been open since the end of last year, and now we are working on the south end of the house, Washington study, and that phase 2 work is slated to finish up at the beginning of March. And then the study in the new room will be open while the rest of the house is closed. So here are the phases of the work from January to July of 2024. Actually, we went a little later than July. We had the new room closed, and the rest of the white part is open. The tan part is closed. From October 2024 until March of this year, most of the house has been closed except for the new room. And then starting in March, we will reopen the study. And then finally, in October of this year, we will reopen the entirety of the house. So you'll be able to visit both the first and the second floors. The only part that will not be available to visitors will be the cellar while we finish up the final touches on restoring the cellar to how it appeared in the 18th century. And here's the plan of what that cellar will look like when it's completed. Now, if you have been to the cellar, what you will have seen is that there were a lot of brick piers that were put into it that were not there in Washington's lifetime. They were added in the 19th and 20th centuries to shore up the floor once those sills started to be removed. But we're restoring the cellar back to reflect a drawing that Washington created in 1773 before he left to go up in 1775 to fight the Revolution. In 1775, they added the south end, the study wing of the house, and in 1776, they added the north addition where the new room is. You can see on the right here, there's a large room that is a cellar kitchen and servants' hall. And then you can see that there are a couple of rooms and a staircase along the bottom end of that room, which is the west side. That staircase allowed service to be brought up to the dining room on the first floor. And the two rooms that flank it on either side were set aside as quarters for an enslaved family. Through documentary research, we were able for the first time to identify the fact that an enslaved family, the Lee family, if any of you are familiar with Washington's career in the Revolution, or if you saw that A&E series Turn, you probably are familiar with Billy Lee, who was Washington's body servant during the Revolution. His brother Frank Lee was the enslaved butler during the Washington's ownership of Mount Vernon. And Frank and his wife, Lucy, the cook, lived in rooms down in the cellar with their children. It is the first time in our history of studying the mansion that we've been able to place an enslaved family living under the same roof in the house with the Washingtons. It really brings home an important aspect of service life in the house and how dependent the Washingtons and their guests were on the enslaved labor that provided the food, cleaned the house, met the needs of all those who lived above the stairs, above the cellar. Additionally, as you move to the left, away from the kitchen, there were a series of 4 locked storage rooms. And then on the north side of that long passage that you see there, you see the dotted line that is the piazza that faces the river. And then underneath the piazza were 3 vaulted chambers that were used for wet storage. So they are basically wine cellars. So all of that will be restored, and all of that will be open for interpretation by the end of 2025. So stay tuned. And we are very happy to be welcoming you all back at the end of this year to a new, fully restored mansion. Now, just to let you see the mansion in as it was before we began this massive work and put fences up all around it. Mount Vernon is one of the most recognizable historic homes in the United States. It has been visited by more guests than any other presidential home. And how it arrived at this vaunted position may not be known to all of you. So if you don't know, please bear with me. So if you do know how that happened, please bear with me while I quickly run through a story which in and of itself could be the topic of a 1-hour lecture. So I'm going to move through pretty quickly. George Washington is rightly famous for his role in the founding of the United States. And even during his lifetime, there was a close association between the man and the mansion. The veneration of Washington began during the Revolution and increased during his presidency. And this translated into visitors to his home. Washington recorded that during 1798, there were 677 overnight stays at his home, meaning that there was an average of 1.8 visitors in the house every night of the year. After Washington's death in 1799, the status of Mount Vernon as a place of pilgrimage only increased. Martha Washington lived out the rest of her life in a house she shared with her husband for 40 years. And at the time of her death in 1802, the plantation passed to George's nephew, Bushrod, who had followed his uncle's example in public service, having been appointed and serving as a justice on the U.S. Supreme Court. Upon Bushrod's death, childless, in 1829, the property briefly passed to his nephew, John Augustine Washington II, and then to his wife, Jane Blackburn Washington, who managed the plantation until their son, John Augustine III, reached his majority in 1850. During the first half of the 19th century, visitation to the estate continued unabated. John Augustine III tried to embrace his home's celebrity status, but eventually the maintenance of the site, worn by hordes of pilgrims, became too much for him. And in a short time, he decided to offer Mount Vernon for sale to the federal government. They didn't want it. And to the Commonwealth of Virginia. But they didn't want it either, because neither of these two governments had mechanisms in place to care for an old house intended to be operated as a museum. There was no National Park Service at this time. So it was during this time, in 1852, that a South Carolina matron visited Mount Vernon and wrote to her daughter, bemoaning the condition of the house and the apparent indifference of all male government structures. If the men of America have seen fit to allow the home of its most respected hero to go to ruin, why can't the women of America band together to save it? The recipient of that letter, Anne Pamela Cunningham, took up her mother's challenge and issued a call to the women of the United States to save Washington's home. The result was the formation of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. Here is the first board of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association around 1866. The task facing the ladies, as they are still known today, and if you don't know, they still own Mount Vernon. It is a privately owned museum. It is run by a board of all women. It's a pretty impressive and formidable group of women. And the task facing the ladies was indeed formidable. John Augustine Washington initially needed convincing to sell the home to a group of women, but eventually he agreed to sell them the house, the outbuildings, and 200 acres for the substantial sum of $200,000. So at a time when they didn't even have the right to vote, these determined women organized, raised the funds, and purchased the property, initiating the first restoration campaign in 1859. This is a photograph of the house from 1859 showing the work being carried out on the piazza. So the piazza, of course, we're looking at the west front, the land front here. But if you look through the main door, you can see an X of scaffolding that we can see on the other side of the house. And if you look above the house to the left, you can see a crane. And if you look over to the right as well, above the colonnade, you can see a crane as well. These cranes, so we're hauling up timbers to reconstruct a failing piazza. So we are actually seeing the first preservation work captured in this photograph, which is amazing. And the work of preservation, of preserving the mansion, continues today, 166 years later, including substantial work that we once again visited upon the piazza here in 2022 to 23. And as I said, last January, we began the mansion revitalization. It is addressing the very foundations of the mansion itself, preparing it for its fourth century as it turns 300 in 2034. The mansion has been the subject of continuous study as a house museum since 1860, longer than any other building in America. It is associated with an extensive corpus of written and graphic documentation that begins in the late 18th. It begins in the 18th century and continues to the present day. Of course, no complete house history can be based solely on documents and archival research. A thorough understanding of a building can only be attained through the study of records in tandem with the building itself, the bricks, the timbers, the finishes, the tools that were used to create them. The approach of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association has always been to listen to the house itself, and significant efforts in this vein have included early paint investigations in the 1860s, the restoration diary of Harrison H. Dodd, the resident superintendent from 1885 to 1937, in which were recorded the details of all his work and discoveries. The investigations of Morley Williams, Director of Research and Restoration from 1935 to 1939, and of resident architect Walter Maycomer, whose reports span his 30-year tenure beginning in 1935. And today, the Mount Vernon H-BIM, a 3D model of the house begun in 2015 as an innovative tool to aid in understanding and maintaining the building and its associated documentation. The early efforts pieced together the overall development of the mansion from a one-story house to the 11,000 square foot structure we have today. And if you look at this model, red indicates the first phase of the house, blue indicates the second period of construction, and white is the third period of construction. So 1730s, 1750s, and then 1770s for the white. But despite knowing the basic evolution of the house for quite some time, it is only in recent days, through the application of forensic investigative techniques and scientific testing, that we are able to more clearly understand the full biography of the house over its nearly 3-year history. The picture that has emerged indicates earlier generations of Washingtons used architecture to communicate their status or ambition to status long before George and Martha Washington presented their home at the pinnacle of American society in the early decades of the Republic. For nearly, skip that one. So there's the house as it would have looked originally, and there's one of the upgrades, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation. For nearly a century now, the basic evolution of the mansion has been understood, and it began as a one-story house with a garret. That is, while it did not have a full second story, it had habitable rooms tucked up under the roof with sloping ceilings. In 1758, the roof was raised to create a full second story, again with rooms under a garret. Its final expansions in the 1770s and 1780s gave it its current form. Despite having this general grasp of the growth of the house for so long, one of the most basic facts about the building was unknown until recently. When was it built? Note that this drawing starts with 1757. That's because 1757 was the last year before George Washington initiated major change in the house in 1758. So it might have just been as well called pre-1758 with no starting date. But it leaves open the questions of when the house was built and for whom. George's father, Augustine, who lived on the parcel in the 1730s, or perhaps for Lawrence, the general's half-brother, who lived on the newly named Mount Vernon plantation in the 1740s and 50s. The question was settled definitively in 2006 by tree ring dating, or dendrochronology. The science of dendrochronology involves the creation of a master ring sequence for a tree species in a particular region. Trees of the same species will lay down growth rings, annual growth rings, of identical size based on local climatic conditions. When a tree is harvested for a building project, the last growth ring laid down indicates the year that the tree was felled. In the mansion, multiple timbers spread throughout the earliest part of the house were felled between the spring of 1732 and the spring of 1734. Period building practice used trees that were freshly cut. Therefore, trees harvested in the spring were generally used for construction in the following summer, while the wood was still green. A dendrochronological date of 1734 ties nicely with documentary evidence of Augustine Washington, George's father, serving as a vestryman at nearby Truro Anglican Parish in November of 1735. Vestrymen were required to live within the bounds of the parish, and thus Augustine and his family, including young George, were in residence by then. They did not stay long, however. Church records also indicate that Augustine moved the family to Fredericksburg, Virginia, by the close of 1738. With his 1734 house, Augustine Washington made a statement. Although it was in the middle of nowhere, far from the capitals of both Virginia and Maryland, it was nevertheless substantial. Its footprint was nearly 32 by 50 feet, totaling 3,000 square feet. And it featured 5 spacious rooms on the first floor with 6 additional rooms above stairs. We know that this house faced the river because the stairs to the second floor faced the east door. You can see that in this plan, as they still do today. And because the east side of the house, with its symmetrically placed windows, presented a more formal front to the river. The placement of the stairs shifted the door on the west front to the left of the center axis, a location it maintains today. So people ask all the time, why is the west front not symmetrical? Why is the door off center? Now you know the answer. It's that staircase which still remains in the center passage of the house. It shifts the door to the north. The exterior of the house probably had plain weatherboarded siding in 1734, like most Virginia houses, but the scale of the early mansion made it stand out from many of its contemporaries, most of which were made up of only 1 or 2 rooms in total. Extensive archaeological and architectural investigation in the mansion's cellar, beginning in 2018, clarified much about the early form of the house. Our current understanding is that the house originally had no cellar. So here is the foundation of that 1734 house, and you can see it just has a very shallow crawl space below the first floor. It stood on typical brick or stone foundations, little more than a foot wide and about 30 inches down into the ground. But some years after its construction, likely during the ownership of Lawrence Washington in the 1740s, a partial cellar was excavated. So they dug out the cellar under that in that little tiny crawl space by hand. The cellar pit was then lined with stone inside the footprint of the house's foundation, creating one of the biggest confusions as to understanding the early house. This odd 2-wall configuration led to speculation that the early house at some point was expanded just a foot in either direction, or that there were 2 different houses built on or around the foundation at various times in the early decades of its existence. So if we look again at 1734 here, they dug out to the left where the beams go, dug out that crawl space to create a small partial cellar. Well, not that small, but not a full cellar, but a partial cellar. And then they lined it with stone in order to prevent the clay beneath the foundations from collapsing into that new cellar. So so the cellar was slightly smaller than the footprint of the house. Unraveling the history of the cellar has also shed light on the form and plan of the early house more generally. Archaeology in the cellar uncovered the locations of the stone walls lining the partial cellar excavation, indicating that it lay beneath the central passage and the southern halves of the two parlors here in red. So those red lines indicate the extent of that partial cellar that was dug out, likely in the 1740s. In this composite photograph of the archaeological work done in the cellar, you can see the locations of the remaining foundations of those lining walls, the stone walls that were in that drawing I showed you here, and evidence for cellar partition walls that created separate rooms in the cellar here in yellow. Now, this is a closer view, and we can remove our outlines so you can just see. Now, if you look along, I don't know if you can see, there's no pointer, way for me to do a pointer, but if you look along the bottom where the white is, there's a stone wall there. There's a stone wall under the red there that runs up the left along the fireplace, the chimney. And then where the white stops, that little white stops, you can see a dugout trench that goes up to the top of the screen, just inside the white line. And you can see there's kind of a robbed out trench, and then stone starts to appear as you go to the right. And then it makes a hard here again in yellow, were placed to support the partition walls of the first floor. So the walls that make up the rooms of the first floor had to be supported when they dug out the cellar. So you can see those yellow walls actually follow where the partition walls of the house are. But note that there is no dividing wall. There's no underpinning wall here where the purple line is, that the wall that creates the little parlor and cuts it off from the central passage of the house. It has no underpinning wall, as you can see. The yellow is the underpinning partitions. And then here, and that's because, it suggests that this wall, that purple wall, between the east end of the passage and the little parlor to the north, on the first floor, is a later addition to the house, meaning that wall wasn't there in 1734. Because if it existed when the cellar was dug out in the 1740s, it too would have required underpinning. This hypothesis was confirmed by an examination of the tops of the studs that make up that wall. So basically, I wiggled under the second floor floorboards and looked, and this is what I found. This is the top of one of the studs and one of the floor framing members of the second floor. Instead of being joined into the frame with mortise and tenon joints, meaning a tongue that would actually stick into a slot on the underside of that big beam that you see in the upper right-hand corner of this image. The studs, and that was the condition of every other stud in every other wall of the first floor of the original house, except for this wall. And here, as you can see, they were just stuck in, and then you can see a bunch of nails were sort of pounded in to attach them to the underside of that big framing member to the right. So that indicates that this wall was actually an alteration to the original 1734 house plan. Additionally, in 1899, medical evidence showing that a partition wall originally divided the passage into two separate spaces, east and west. And this wall, which was removed at some point during the 18th century, was indeed underpinned. So here you can see the vertical yellow to the right of that, underneath the word passage. There was a wall there originally, and if we look at the there's the wall I'm talking about in purple, but it was not, and it was actually underpinned when they dug out the cellar. So there was a wall there early, but it was later removed. Now, Untwining all of these removals and addition gives the early house a plan which is seen in some other contemporary Virginia houses, with a long room across one side of the house and a stair room housing a narrow, steep staircase in the same location as the current stair. So here's that plan. The east front, which overlooks the river, instead of having that center passage, the center passage is divided in half, and you've got the stair to the west, and then you have that odd long room across the east front there. Now, the stair still remains in the same location today. So on the left, you see an artist's reconstruction of what we think, if you would, it's a see-through wall, but you can see the dotted line showing where the wall was. And then once they removed the wall and created the central passage, you can see the big fancy black walnut staircase that George Washington had installed in 1758. Now, in addition to that early stair, which paint evidence confirms that the parts of that stair, the balusters, the little turned columns, and the handrail of this 1734 early stair were reused in 1758 to create the stair to the garret, to the third floor of the mansion. And you can see it there today when you do your tour of the house. And the reason we know it's different is that if you see in the lower right corner, there's a photograph that has some labeled arrows. The tan paint, number 4, we know that this was that all of the addition that was made in 1758, when they blew the roof off the house and made it a full second story, everything was painted tan when they did that work. But you can see that there are 3 layers of finish, 1, 2, and 3, before that 1758 goes on. And so this staircase, the parts of this staircase, are older than the 1758 part of the house, and they were taken apart when they built the new stair and then reassembled to create a new staircase up to the new third floor. So in addition to that stair, which was originally painted a deep red brown, we have other evidence of interior finishes from Augustine's 1730s home. Behind later wood paneling in the front parlor, and here you see a slightly younger version of myself looking through removed paneling at an earlier wall finish from the 1730s. We found fragments of early trim, a black painted baseboard. And if you look closely at this, you can see there's a face nail kind of nailing it there on the lower left there. But notice the striations going across it. That's because the plane that the carpenter used to make this had nicks in the blade. And those striations were laid down in 1734 when this chair rail was installed. And when we saw this, we were some of the first people to ever see this since it was closed up in the 18th century. It's pretty exciting for us. There was also a chair rail, and here we are peeking into the wall. You can see that green painted chair rail has a bead at the bottom and a little OG and a flat surface at the top. And then also a fragment of cornice. Again, you see some of that green paint running below those 2 nails that you see. There would have been a crown molding that those 2 nails held in place. It got taken off because it was too big to fit inside the new wall cavity. Also associated with the early house is an iron fireback. It was found in the ruins of Hayfield, the home of Lund, Washington, George's, which burned in 1917. Lund was George's cousin, who was the overseer for the plantation and the work of expanding the mansion in the 1770s. The fireback bears the date 1734, as you can see, and the initials A. W. M, which stands for Augustine and Mary Washington. So those are George's parents. This fireback is believed to have been cast for the mansion house when it was originally constructed. It is not out of the realm of possibility that Lundy installed this as part of the 1770s work, and then that he, as a perk of his job, took it home with him to Hayfield. His famous cousin George, away fighting the Revolution, probably didn't even realize it was gone. So, with the removal of Augustine Washington's family from the mansion in 1739, the property became the home of Augustine's eldest son, Lawrence, who is seen here in a portrait. Lawrence was a social climber who had been schooled in England, where he would have been exposed to recent architectural trends. In 1743, he made a very advantageous marriage to Anne Fairfax, the daughter of Colonel William Fairfax, a match that seems to have provided the financial wherewithal to modernize and improve his new home. Recent architectural investigations have brought to light a second period of construction, which had no associated written documentation, but which forensic evidence suggests dates between the 1734 initial construction period and the expansion undertaken by George in 1758. This means that Lawrence is the likely suspect for ordering these changes, and it is the first time that we are able to identify his direct influence on the form or finish of the building. It is likely that Lawrence was responsible for creating the center passage plan in the house. So here's that early plan. Now that long room is down at the bottom and not on the top. This plan is reversed, and you can see the little stair on the west side of the house. And there's that in the center, you see that heavy black line indicating the wall that separated that long room from the stair room. So Lawrence would have brought about the removal of that wall and the insertion of the wall that I told you had the studs that were nailed in, and we peeked under the floorboards to look at. And so then that gave us basically the same configuration of the center part of the mansion as you will see it today, with a center passage and then two rooms on either side of it, north and south. The short wall, the one that came in to create the center passage, was finished with lath and plaster, and a chair rail was installed and was painted 2 times before it got covered up by the wooden paneling that George Washington installed in the 1760s. So here is a slightly more familiar, on the right, more familiar looking center passage. And all that paneling that you see in that photograph was put in. We know that was put in the early 1760s for George Washington. But behind that paneling, there's an earlier plaster finish and a preserved chair rail with 2 generations of paint on it. The painting sequence suggests, the 2 generations suggests, that the wall existed perhaps 20 years before the paneling was installed. This would imply that the center passage was created in the 1740s during Lawrence Washington's residency here. Major life events are frequently the inspiration for such changes in a house. So Lawrence is taking over the plantation about 1740 and getting married in 1743 provide 2 such events that might be tied to this major change to the plan of the house. The introduction, I went ahead. The introduction of the center passage was a significant upgrade to the previous plan of the house. The passage manifested the emergence of a more hierarchical social structure in Virginia that mimicked the class consciousness of Britain. It provided a way to control who visited what parts of your house. A center passage house was imposing and fashionable and told visitors that your family was of a higher social status than most. And it is likely that Lawrence, who was schooled in England in the 1730s, was familiar with this plan, which was taking hold in the second quarter in England in the second quarter of the 18th century. But this was likely not the only change made by Lawrence during his ownership of the mansion. He installed new finishes in at least two other first floor spaces. Lawrence had wooden paneling installed in the old chamber, covered, covered, covering an earlier plaster finish. So this, there are several clues in this paneling that tie the work to Lawrence and not George. First, the paneling differs in key details from the paneling in the central passage and the paneling in the front parlor, both of which were installed for George in the 1760s. The moldings that you see in this room are the moldings are different from the moldings of the center passage and the parlor, which are identical because they were all done by the same carpenter in the 1760s. But this room was done at a different time by different carpenters. The most telling evidence, though, is the paint analysis done in this particular space, which revealed that the room had been painted 19 times in its history, opposed to the paneling from the 1760s in the passage and the parlor, both of which were just painted 15 times. This tightens up the differences between these two rooms, meaning that the elements in this room were painted at least 5 times before 1775, when the south addition was added to the house, which created the study wing, likely putting it in Lawrence's period. The final exciting architectural upgrade that we have been able to associate with Lawrence, Washington, can be found in the front parlor. That's the room on the west side of the northwest corner of the center part of the house, here in red. Behind the wooden paneling that you see here, installed for George Washington in the 1760s, we found, as I told you, fragments of 2 successive generations of finish. There are the chair rail, the baseboard, and the cornice, which we looked at. But there were also found fragments of raised plaster paneling. And what I mean by that, so we're looking inside one of the wooden panels. One of the wooden panels has been removed, and you can see half of the panel is over there on the right. But we're looking beyond that to this green paneling, and you can see it's broken. It's made of plaster. But if you look closely at it, it has a raised flat panel, and it actually mimics the wooden paneling that we're also very familiar with for 18th century houses. Such plaster paneling can be found in houses in Britain and Ireland during the early 18th century, but it's found in only a handful of examples in America, such as the James Bryce House in Annapolis, and the panels that you see here are executed in plaster and not wood. And there are a number of examples that survive in Maryland. But it seems, based on those examples that we know of, that ours is the earliest, or one of the earliest, done in the 1740s. Many of the ones in Annapolis, because there's probably about 4 or 5 in Annapolis, they date to the late 1750s and the 1760s. So exciting, high-end, London-type finishes being installed in this house in the 1740s, almost contemporary with the height of their popularity in London and in Ireland. And here are some of the fragments that we discovered of that plaster paneling. And so you can see by looking at it in the side view on the right-hand photo, where it has kind of a flat panel, like the flat part on the right is the flat of a panel, and then it has a beveled edge. And then you can see there's on the lower piece, there's sort of a wiggle on that left-hand side of it. That is an ogee. So these clearly imitate the detailing of wooden paneling. So the plaster paneling at Mount Vernon has a rough, sandy texture that you can see here, meant to imitate stone. The paint analysis that we did on it shows that the plaster panels have been painted twice before they were covered up in the 1760s. And again, just like in the passage I said, that equals in paint applications, that equals generally in this house about 20 years. So we're looking at 1740s again. But the chair rail and cornice that I showed you hidden behind the wooden paneling that are associated with this raised plaster paneling, those, the wooden elements, the chair rail and the cornice, they date to the 1734 period because they have at least 2 additional generations of paint on top of or underneath the 2 that are associated with the fragments of this raised, this green raised plaster paneling. So it's clear that they were installed, the wooden elements, chair rail, cornice, baseboard, were installed in 1734. Lawrence ripped out existing flat plaster paneling and then had the raised plaster paneling installed in the 1740s. Now, this particular fragment, which you see me holding in this photograph, is pretty amusing because you can see that it's a corner fragment of one of the plaster panels, and it is struck with a little miter joint as if it had been pieced together through pieces of wood. The detailing is really, really astounding. All of this paneling, this plaster paneling, was covered up in the 1760s with the current wood paneling, likely because settling in the house caused major cracking in the plaster and deformation of the woodwork. You can see here in this image, if you look, so you see the wooden paneling of the current that is currently on display in the front parlor. And you can see that we've taken the chair rail off between the vertical panels and those horizontal panels at the bottom. The chair rail is removed, and you can look into the wall cavity. And there you can see that green painted chair rail that we looked at a little bit earlier. But if you follow the line of that chair rail, on the left, it's down, and then it starts to rise up, and then it starts to sink down again. So you can see that it is actually bent out of shape by the settling of the house during the 18th century. So the bend there, that settlement, caused that plaster paneling that we were looking at to crack and to fall down. And in fact, most of the fragments that we found were behind the baseboards of the 1760s paneling that had just fallen off the wall between the 1760s and 2016 when we started to pull it, when we found it and started to pull it all out. There were dozens and dozens of pieces of it. And we do know that there are fragments still adhered to the lath that's in place, hidden behind the existing wooden paneling. So Mount Vernon Mansion evolved over the course of the 18th century, serving first as a large but simply furnished home to Augustine Washington and his family in the 1730s. Followed during the following decades, the house underwent significant improvements during the ownership of Lawrence Washington, who brought in more in line with contemporary English tastes, and the family habit of home improvement was continued by George Washington, who expanded and remodeled the house and updated the home multiple times in his 40-year ownership of the estate, leaving us the mansion that we are so familiar with today. And here you see it circa 1792 in one of the famous paintings of the mansion by Edward Savage. But before I close, I would be remiss if I didn't address the 250-year-old bottles that were found during the course of excavation while we prepared for the mansion revitalization project. These are the first bottles we found. They contained cherries in both of them. I'm sure most of you heard about it. One of our staff members was in Africa climbing Mount Kilimanjaro when we made the discovery, and people on her tour approached her and said, wow, they found these bottles at Mount Vernon, and all the way in Africa, they were talking about it. The team uncovered these two bottles in a pit dug into the mansion cellar floor. The bottles proved to contain some very well preserved cherries, and here we are glopping the cherries out of the bottle. And when we were really excited that the bottles had fruit, but it was even more exciting a few weeks later when we ended up finding a total of 35 bottles in a series of 3 pits underneath the cellar floor. 29 were completely intact and still contained fruit, but only a few of them contained cherries. And when we pulled the cherries out, as you see in this picture, the entire laboratory filled with the smell of cherries. It was pretty amazing. The liquid in the bottles with the fruit is not alcohol. It's not brandy. It's not any kind of preservative. The liquid appears to be groundwater that dripped into the bottles over the course of the centuries, because the bottles were dug, the pits were dug, the bottles were placed, and every one of these little cellophane with the pink tie indicates the neck of a bottle. And you can see there's several pits of them, several clusters of them, as our archaeologists are excavating here. We have been working with scientists from the USDA to analyze the contents of the bottles and to find out what sorts of fruits that we have. The bottles contain cherries, they can contain blackberries, and they contain gooseberries. So why these fruit bottles exist is because it was a very common practice. And here's a group of the bottles excavated but not removed from the pits yet. It was very common practice to bottle fresh berries, dry bottle them, put a cork in, and then bury them underground in order to get a consistent cool temperature below the surface. And in 1795, Martha Washington wrote her niece Fanny. Martha was in Philadelphia. This was during the presidency. And Fanny Bassett was tending Mount Vernon during the presidency. And Martha wrote, "I am very much obliged to you, my dear Fanny, for offering to preserve strawberry for me. I don't think it will be worthwhile. We shall always have green fruit which can be preserved at the time it is wanted." Now here's the money quotation. "Should there be any gooseberry, I should wish to have some bottled." And there indeed you are looking at bottled gooseberries in this photograph. "I should think old Doll cannot forgot how to do them." Doll was an enslaved woman who accompanied Martha to Mount Vernon after her marriage to George in 1759. And Doll was clearly the keeper of this knowledge on the plantation for preserving fruit, and it was likely she who created our fruit bottles. Now, the theory as to why there were so many bottles in this area of the cellar actually allows me to finally quote the people responsible for following the bottles. Dr. Jason Burrows, our project archaeologist, has suggested that this batch of fruit represents the harvest of 1775. That year, George Washington left Mount Vernon to serve in the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. At the Congress, he accepted command of the Continental Army, and he set up for Boston. He did not return to Mount Vernon for any significant time until 8 years later. In the interim, Lund Washington, Washington's cousin, the overseer, reorganized the cellar according to the general's plans and paved over the bottle pits. So the paving that we pulled up in order to excavate was from the 1775 expansion of the cellar. Thus, the forgotten fruit bottles reflect the disruption of normal life that the Mount Vernon community experienced after the Washington's departure on the eve of independence. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will stop sharing my screen so that we can have some questions.
Tom, thank you very much. That was very, very interesting. Thank you. And you go to Mount Vernon and you look on the surface and you make certain judgments on it. And now we know a little bit what's under that surface. So thank you.
Well,
And go ahead.
it is a great opportunity. We do find so much in our work about our period of interpretation is 1799, last year of Washington's life, and we learn so much about the before and the after of the place's history that we don't get to really talk about in the short path that you make your way through the mansion. So we try to put that kind of stuff up on a website and to have outreach like this so that we can discuss those sorts of things.
Well, we feel very lucky that you outreach to us. So thank you very much. Besides the cherries, were there other things that you discovered that were indicative of the living of George Washington and his wife living there? Daily living activity.
Uh, sure. Well, what was surprising is that the archaeology that was done, we didn't actually find a lot in the cellar, like a lot of objects. There wasn't a lot of broken ceramics. There weren't a lot of broken bottles, other than that concentrated burying of the bottles that we looked at. One of the things we did discover, which is pretty exciting, is that in the room off the kitchen in the cellar, that we know that the Lee family lived in, underneath one of the pavers, it was paved with square tiles. And directly under one of those square tiles, those tiles measure 9 by 9 inches. When the archaeologist pulled it up, there was an 8.5 by 8.5 inch hole, perfectly square, dug down. It was actually filled with debris, but it was what archaeologists call a subfloor pit, which is normally they're almost always associated with slave quarters, because when you were enslaved, you were often housed in communal settings, and anything that you owned, you didn't own a lot, but you did own some things that were your personal property. And the enslaved would often dig holes underneath the bedrolls where they would sleep, and they would dig a little hole, put their belongings in it, cover it with a board, and then sleep on top of it so no one could steal their stuff. And even in the Lee's room, which we think only they occupied, they were so used to this practice that they made this little hiding space beneath the paved floor of the mansion cellar, perhaps a place where they buried things that they didn't want the Washingtons to know they had, or they maybe felt it was none of the Washingtons' business to meddle in their personal possessions. But it was a pretty electrifying discovery to find this little space of this little private space that belonged to this enslaved family.
Very interesting. All right, so I have a few questions from our audience here. Karen asks, when will the project be completed?
So the whole house, well, the study will open up the beginning of next month in March. So then the new room and the study will be available for the tour. The rest of the house will remain closed until the fall of 2025. So then the normal tour path through the front, through the new room, and then on the piazza, through the whole house, upstairs, and then out the study, that will reopen this fall. We'll finish up our work on restoring the cellar in the spring of 2026.
So if any of us have visitors, Mount Vernon is open now, and we can see a lot.
It is open. And in fact, it's kind of an exciting time to come because you get to see some of this stuff going on. And we've activated our outbuildings more than we have in the past. So there's lots of interpretation going on about in the outbuildings, and we're talking about life on the estate in a broader way, because we're showing you less of the mansion currently, but you still can have access to part of the mansion, and we are still open for business.
Perfect, thank you. Elizabeth asks, is the site inherently moist and wet? You talk a lot about moisture, humidity, drainage, yet the site appears to be elevated and should drain well. What is the site's characteristics, and was it a good choice when Augustine bought it or chose it?
It was good. It was a good spot to build a house. It's up on the high ground, as you rightly noted, Elizabeth. But when the cellar was dug, it was dug into solid clay. So the cellar became sort of like a bathtub. So any runoff from the rain that manages to permeate through the cellar walls just sort of sits down in this bathtub. In fact, one of the other things that we discovered is a very complicated series of drains that were built in the cellar, and they start by catching roof runoff on the north side of the building. That runs down through the cellar. Every single room had a drain that kind of fed into a large trunk drain that runs from north to south in the cellar. It exits out the south end of the cellar and then runs down toward the stable and pours into the dung repository, where Washington was collecting organic waste, manure, things like that, and mixing that with the water runoff from the roof of the mansion and the cellar of the mansion in order to create compost. So it's where he was making fertilizer for his agricultural experiments in the 1790s.
Okay, thank you. Mort doesn't have a question. He just has a comment. He says, wonderful presentation, 3 exclamation points. Thank you very much, Mr. Reinhart. So
Thank
he's
you.
one of many people that really enjoyed it. Carol asks, were paints lead-based at that point?
Yes, they were. The paints are generally made up of pigments and binders. In the 18th century, the basic pigment for white paint was lead white. So how they made it is they took sheets of lead and they heated vinegar that caused the lead to corrode and turn white, and then they would scrape that corrosion off, grind it up, and mix it with a binder. And that binder was generally some kind of oil. In the case of house paints, it was almost always linseed oil. And then in order to make other colors, you would mix ochre and other earth found. Some actually by the middle of the 18th century, they have a number of synthetic pigments as well. You can make greens and blues and the like. And at Mount Vernon now, we have gone back to using traditional hand ground paints on the interior of the house that are linseed oil based. And on the exterior, we use a commercially available linseed oil based paint. We do not put lead into it for our white paints, and we do not use red lead for our red paints either. Now, when you use lead as your basic white pigment, it doesn't make a bright white like today's. You go to the Home Depot and buy a white paint; it's a bright white. The white created by mixing lead white and linseed oil is a very warm off-white. And that explains why the house changed in color from the 1900s, a very bright white, and in the 2000s, it got kind of darker because paint analysis very clearly showed that it was a warm white was the base coat of the paint. The other thing that was responsible for the change to that kind of buff color that you see today when you come and visit the house was that in the 1790s, Washington gave instructions for painting the house. He painted it with that warm white color paint, and then he had enslaved workers throw sand on that wet paint, and it creates a crust of sand that was taken from the local sandstone. And that's a very he wanted it to look that tan color because that made it look like it was made out of stone, which was the entire reason for doing this process.
So are any of the exterior walls made out of stone? They're all wood with the sand applied?
Everything above the ground is made out of wood with sand applied. There are some stone walls in the cellar, which you can see when we reopen the cellar. But all of the mansion above ground is made out of wood. Some of it is cut to make it look like stone blocks, and then it's treated with the sand paint finish to kind of finish off that trompe-l'oeil of making it look like stone blocks.
Okay, thank you. Millie asked the question, how common was digging a cellar after construction during that time?
Well, it wasn't uncommon. Houses in the early habitation period in Virginia, houses often didn't even have foundations. The posts of the walls went straight down into the ground. It's a type of construction called earth-fast construction. The floor was raised up off the ground, but the posts went straight into the ground, and there was no brick foundation. Once they start wanting to have cellars for storage, they begin to dig out beneath houses. They also start building new with brick or stone foundations and cellars with the house standing on those new brick and stone foundations. So it wasn't uncommon to retrofit a house with a cellar, but it also at the same time wasn't uncommon to build houses with cellars from the get-go. The extensions of the mansion in the 1770s, under the new room, under the study, they were built with full depth cellars from the beginning. It's just that center part of the house that didn't originally have it.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned George Washington, and he gave instructions for how to apply the stand and that kind of thing. Was he very involved in the planning of his renovations? He was out fighting the war, but was he still involved?
Well, part of the reason why we have so much documentation about this plantation is because for much of the building and alterations of the house and the outbuildings, Washington wasn't here. Originally, he's fighting the French and Indian War, then he's here for 10 years, then he goes to the Revolution, and he's gone for 10 years, and then he's back in the 1780s, and then he's elected president, and he's gone for another 10 years, basically. And they're doing work on the house all through that time, and they're coming back and visiting and staying there for vacations, and then they're going back to wherever they need to be. So to describe George Washington kindly, his personality was a bit meticulous. He was a little bit of a type A, right? We would maybe call him anal retentive today. He was on top of what was going on at Mount Vernon while he was away. The best example I like to give of this is while he was camped on the battlefield at the Battle of Long Island in 1776, he was writing a letter the night before the battle. He was writing a letter back to Mount Vernon, badgering Lund Washington, his cousin and the plantation overseer, to put siding up on the new north addition to the house where the new room is, so that the frame didn't rot. He wanted it sided before the winter, and he wanted a roof on it before winter. He's doing this while the British are about to land and engage the Continental Army in battle. Mount Vernon provided something in his life that he had control over, right? He couldn't control the Continental Army particularly well. He certainly couldn't control the British. The fortunes of the war were up and down, mostly down during many of those middle years of the Revolution. And then when he's president again, he's trying to control a bunch of the founders and these politicians who are like trying to herd cats in creating this new government and establishing the parameters of it. But Mount Vernon was always a constant for him. It was always on his mind. He got weekly updates from his plantation managers, and he wrote weekly letters back commenting on those updates, giving instructions throughout the Revolution and especially through the presidency as well.
Thank you. You mentioned a lot of different types of people that work on this kind of renovation, archaeologists and historians. And does it all get coordinated through you? I mean, do you have weekly meetings and you decided, this paint color was popular in this era, so that's the historic piece of it, and then there's the archaeologist discovering something else. Who is the core team, I guess, is really what I'm asking.
So generally, it's Mount Vernon staff that is the core team. So we have an architectural preservation department. We have an archaeology department, and they're both in the preservation department. And I oversee both of those programs. And up until we started Mansion Revitalization, which, as you might imagine, is a pretty big project that involves major infrastructure improvements, the whole shoring of the house with all that steel. We actually hired an outside contractor to kind of manage the movements of all of those bigger pieces. But still, they meet weekly with me. I'm on site every day. I have a restoration manager who never leaves the site while work is going on. And she is on top of things minute to minute as to what's happening. So a project of this scale is, as I said, never been undertaken here before. So we've kind of got a new model. At least it's a temporary model. Once this project is finished, we'll go back to doing the work ourselves. We have a staff of carpenters that are extremely talented at doing restoration work and preservation work. And I do want to make one It's one of my it's kind of one of my bugaboos, Louise. We do not renovate here at Mount Vernon. We restore. Right.
Thank
So
you.
we try to preserve. Now we do put new pieces in, but we try to preserve every atom of Washington era fabric in our work. We can't always do it, but we try. It is the basic core tenet of our approach is that we are trying to preserve as much of the original as possible for all time.
Well, that was pretty impressive that you used the oak from the wood from the next generation or three generations that was on the land. I mean, that's pretty impressive. That's
Yeah,
definitely
that was a
restored.
nice. That was nice.
That was really nice. So, well, I don't see any other questions here. Your presentation was just great, and the fact that we are in your backyard, Mount Vernon.
Mhm.
Every guest that comes to visit any of us here wants to go to Mount Vernon, so now we have a little bit extra information to tell them. Is there
Great.
any other restoration project on the docket for 5 years from now? I mean, this is
Well,
the main thing.
not even for 5 years from now. Just because I don't know if we're that good or that crazy or that amazingly crazy. While we're doing mental revitalization, we're actually restoring the Washington's bedroom. It's not impacted by the project, but because the second floor was closed, another part of our team has been working on restoring the bedroom which the Washington shared and the room in which Washington died. So when the house reopens at the end of this year, that will be a newly restored interior space as well. And then moving forward, we have a restoration of the 1782 stable, that big brick stable on the south end of the historic area. That's going to get restored based on research that we did here in the United States and over in the United Kingdom. We did a big research trip looking at surviving 18th century stables. So we're very excited about that work coming up. And we're still working through our outbuildings. In the 13 years I've been here, we haven't been able to even complete what we're calling phase one of our outbuilding program, which is to make sure that the exteriors are in the best shape possible. We have 3 or 4 buildings that still need work to be done, and we're working our way north, and so we'll get that done in the next few years as well.
Wow. Wow. Do you sleep? No, I'm
You
kidding.
know,
You're a big
we've got wooden buildings out in the air, right? In the rain, in the snow, in the sunshine, and they're constantly getting beaten upon. And so our job is to get them and keep them in the best shape possible. So there is job security here for someone like me.
Well, that's great. Well, clearly you're very gifted and dedicated and knowledgeable about this area. So thank you very much. I'm
Thank you.
sure glad that I ran into you, Tom, not too long ago at
Yeah,
a cocktail party. So thank you very much. So I really express I see some clapping hands flowing up
I
the.
see them. I see them.
Yep. So that's, I think, just representative of how much we all enjoy this. So everyone, thank you for coming. But before you go, please do fill out the survey with your comments on it, and we will pass them to Tom. Thank you very much, Tom. Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
all, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.